Her cry cracked through the desert night. It sounded like a hawk falling from the sky, a sound too sharp for the silence, too heavy for the thin air. This wasn't a cry of new pain. This was the sound of 30 years of silence finally splintering. The sound of a woman who had spent a lifetime being unseen. Her name was Nita. At 55, her hair was streaked with gray, like thunderclouds that had lost their rain. She sat by her small fire, the flames dancing in her dark eyes, and she whispered the words that had become her truth. Too weak to be loved. The words tasted like ash on her tongue. It was a lie she had been fed, a poison she had learned to drink every single day. There was a time she was fire, a girl whose laugh ran alongside the river, whose hands could weave baskets so tight they held water, carve wood into life, and heal wounds with a touch and a prayer. But time, and a man named Caleb, had weathered her down. Caleb. He was the first man she gave her heart to, and he carved the deepest scar. Not with a blade, but with words. Words that sliced right through her spirit. He called her a burden. He said she was too proud for a woman, too old for real tenderness, too hollow for a man's desire. And she believed him. How could she not? One day, he was there, and the next, he was gone. Vanished, leaving her with nothing but his cruel words as proof of her worthlessness. So she built her life like a fortress, not a home. Her days were filled with hard labor, her nights with a silence that screamed. She raised 2 children, but they grew into strangers, their eyes fixed on horizons far away from her. They left, one by one, chasing lives that didn't have room for their quiet, weathered mother. She worked the dry earth until her palms were thick with calluses no one ever held, no one ever kissed. She hauled water from the well, and with every step, she felt the weight of every rejection she had ever known. The whispers in the nearby town followed her like a shadow. The Apache woman who lived alone, the strange woman who never smiled. She heard them, but she never answered. She just folded their judgments into that deep, quiet place inside her, where she kept everything else. But the body remembers what the mind tries to bury. Sorrow settles in the bones, it pools in the shoulders, it trembles in the throat right as the sun goes down. And tonight, by the fire, she couldn't hold it anymore. She covered her face, and the cry tore its way out. The words she had whispered to herself for decades finally escaped. Too weak to be loved. The fire's glow painted her face in tired copper, but even the flames seemed to pull back from her despair. She was an ember that had forgotten how to burn. The desert didn't care. It breathed its vast, cold indifference all around her. The only answer was the yip of a distant coyote. Others had tried to reach her. Elena, the old healer, once took her hands and said, "You are not ash. You are ember." Nita just shook her head. A young ranch hand named Tom greeted her kindly at the market, but she always looked away, convinced his kindness was just pity. Their words were like hands pressed against a stone wall she could never climb. So she endured. Endurance was the only thing she had left. But tonight, that endurance cracked. The tears cut tracks through the dust on her face, and she let them fall. Each drop hit the thirsty earth. Each one a confession, too weak, too late, too forgotten. Her chest ached with the finality of it. This was the end of hope. She pressed her palms flat against the ground, wishing she could just disappear into it. No one was coming for her. No one had ever waited for her. No one would ever arrive. The fire sighed and dimmed, as if it didn't want to watch anymore. She was dissolving into the night. And then she felt it. A tremor. Subtle at first, a deep vibration in the earth, felt more than heard. She went still, her breath caught in her throat. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and listened. The sound grew, measured, steady, a rhythm, hoofbeats. It was the cadence of a horse crossing a long distance, not hurried, not spooked, deliberate, purposeful. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It was just a traveler, she told herself. A rider passing in the night. A shadow that would be gone in a moment. But the sound kept coming, an echo from a life she had buried long ago. She pulled her shawl tighter, trying to shrink into the darkness, to become invisible again. From over the ridge, a silhouette appeared. A lone rider against the moon. Broad-shouldered, weathered. A man who looked like he was born on a horse. He didn't rush. He guided his horse with a quiet certainty, a figure who felt both strange and familiar all at once. He stopped a short distance from her fire. He dismounted, his movements careful, and stood there, just watching her. He watched her as if seeing her was the only reason he'd ridden all this way. The fire between them suddenly flared, spitting sparks into the sky, as if his presence had woken it up. His silence wasn't empty. It was full. It was a kind of reverence, and though he hadn't said a word, she felt seen. It terrified her. The night held its breath. She clutched her shawl, the lie whispering through her one last time, fragile as breaking glass, too weak to be loved. Then, as the hoofbeats faded into total silence, she looked into his eyes, and she saw a truth that shattered her despair into 1,000 pieces. He was not a stranger. He was a man she had seen once, a lifetime ago, a face on the edge of her memory. A face that now carried the weight of 30 years of waiting carved into every line. The desert wind swept between them, carrying the scent of sage and something else. Something like fate. She didn't know why he was here. She didn't know what his eyes were promising. But the silence was no longer empty. It was charged with the ache of unspoken years. The fire leapt higher, casting their two shadows onto the sand, making them dance. In that moment, Nita knew her story had just been torn wide open. Something she had buried deep in the earth had just clawed its way back to the surface. He stood there, a ghost carved from the moonlight, his gaze holding hers across the fire. The years were heavy on his shoulders, you could see it, but he wore them with a quiet dignity. He was searching her face as if he'd spent every mile of desert looking for this exact moment. The firelight flickered across the lines etched around his eyes, lines carved by sun, wind, and a lifetime of silence. He didn't speak. Not right away. His silence felt deliberate, like a man who had spent more time listening to the earth than to people. Nita waited, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She clutched her shawl so tight her knuckles were white. Finally, his voice came. It was low and steady, a sound that didn't fight the night, but became part of it. "You are not weak." She blinked. The words didn't make sense. It was like he had spoken a foreign language. Her first instinct was to turn away, to retreat back into the fortress she had built, but his eyes held her. They weren't filled with pity or hunger or any of the things she expected. They were filled with a patience so deep, it scared her. "I saw you," he said, his voice still low. "A long time ago, before him. I saw you by the river, your laughter. It was the finest sound I ever heard." He told her he had watched her from a distance, not because he was a coward, he said, but out of a kind of awe. She was a spirit too bright to disturb, so he kept his distance, but he never left. Not really. He'd ridden trails from here to the mountains and back, but the image of her, the sound of her laugh, he carried it with him. A secret ember he kept alive through 30 years of lonely nights under the stars. He got older. The world changed, but he never let her go. Heat rose in her cheeks, but it wasn't from the fire. It was the strange, unnerving feeling of being remembered. The world had taught her to be invisible, to fade into the background. And now this man was telling her that her memory was the one thing he had held on to. The reason he never settled down, never looked for anyone else. She shook her head, the motion jerky. "You wasted your years," she whispered. His reply was quiet, but it hit her with the force of a physical blow. "I didn't waste them," he said, his eyes unwavering. "I grew old waiting for you." The words struck her like a bell ringing in an empty church. She wanted to argue, to tell him she was no prize. She was worn and scarred and not worth a single day of waiting, let alone a lifetime. But his gaze stopped her. It wasn't the look of a man who wanted something from her. It was the look of a man who had come to offer something. The old doubts clawed their way back up her throat. "It's too late," she told him. "I'm too hollow." She used Caleb's word. It felt like poison spitting from her own lips. He just offered her a small, sad smile. "Love doesn't ask for perfect," he said. "It just asks for present." But as he looked at her, a shadow crossed his face. His patience was still there, but something else was underneath it. A question. A darkness. "I came back for another reason, Nita," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "It's not just about you and me." Her heart went cold. "My name is Silas," he said. Caleb was my brother." The world tilted on its axis. The crackling fire, the cool desert air, the stars overhead, it all went sideways. Caleb, his brother. This wasn't a dream of a long-lost admirer. This was a nightmare. A ghost from her past had just walked out of the darkness. "He told me about you," Silas continued, his eyes now hard, searching. "In his letters. He told me how proud you were, how you two fought. He told me this land, your land, meant more to you than anything, more than him." Every word was a twisting knife. Caleb had painted her as a villain in his own story. "He disappeared 30 years ago," Silas said, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth it held just moments before. "He wrote me a final letter. He said he was coming out here to tell you he was leaving for good. He said he was afraid of how you'd react." Nita couldn't breathe. She could only stare at him, at the face of the man who had ridden out of the night to save her, only to become her accuser. "No one ever saw him again," Silas finished, his gaze locking onto hers. "The sheriff back then, he questioned you, but there was no proof. Nothing. He just vanished." He took a step closer to the fire, the light illuminating the grim set of his jaw. "I've spent 30 years wondering, Nita. 30 years with my brother's last words haunting me. So I'm asking you, man to woman, what happened that night? What happened to Caleb?" The hope that had flickered to life in her chest was snuffed out, replaced by a cold, familiar dread. He hadn't come to save her from her loneliness. He had come because he thought she was a murderer. Nita found her voice, but it was a ragged whisper. "I don't know." Silas's eyes narrowed. He didn't believe her. She could see it plain as day. The story was already written in his head, a story told by a dead man. "He left," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "He said cruel things, he packed his bag, and he rode away. That's all. That's the truth." "The sheriff found his horse," Silas shot back. "A mile from here, grazing by the creek, but no Caleb, no saddlebags." Nita flinched. She hadn't known that. The old sheriff, a hard man named Peters, had never told her that detail. He'd just stared at her with suspicion, his questions like stones thrown at her. The whole town had stared. Now, 30 years later, Caleb's brother was here to do the same. "I have nothing to tell you," she said, pulling the shawl around her like armor. "You've wasted your journey." She turned to go back into her small adobe house to shut the door on him and the past he represented. "Wait," Silas said. His voice had changed again. The hardness was still there, but it was edged with something else. Desperation. "I don't want to believe it, Nita. I swear I don't. But I have to know. For my own peace." He paused, running a hand over his tired face. "Help me," he said. "Help me find out what really happened. Let me look around. Talk to people. If you're telling the truth, then you've got nothing to hide. And I can finally put my brother to rest. And then I'll be gone. I promise. Nita stood frozen, her back to him. It was a devil's bargain. Let this man, who suspected her of the worst, dig into her life, into her land, into the most painful chapter of her past. But if she refused, it would only confirm his suspicions. She would be guilty in his eyes forever. And maybe, just maybe, a tiny part of her wanted to know too. Caleb's disappearance had left a jagged hole in her life, a question mark that had festered for 3 decades. Slowly, she turned back around. She looked at this weathered man, this ghost sent by his brother. She saw the pain in his eyes, a pain that mirrored her own, even if it came from a different place. "Fine," she said, her voice cold as the desert floor. "Look, ask your questions. You won't find anything." But as she said it, a shiver ran down her spine. Because she wasn't entirely sure that was true. There were secrets in this land, secrets older than her, older than Caleb, and she had a sudden, terrible feeling that Silas was about to dig them all up. The next morning, the desert sun felt harsh, unforgiving. Silas was up before dawn, his quiet movements a disturbance in Nita's solitary routine. They didn't speak. The air between them was thick with suspicion. He was a hunter, and she was his prey. He started with the land. He walked the perimeter of her small property, his eyes scanning the ground, the rocks, the ancient, twisted junipers. Nita watched him from her window, her stomach in knots. Every rock he turned over felt like he was peeling back a layer of her skin. He spent hours by the creek where Caleb's horse had been found. He found nothing. The land kept its secrets, as it always had. By midday, he rode into town. Nita knew where he was going. He was going to talk to Sheriff Brody, the son of the man who had first investigated Caleb's disappearance. Brody had inherited his father's suspicion of her. She was right. Late in the afternoon, Sheriff Brody's dusty patrol car rumbled up her drive. He got out, a big man whose uniform always seemed a size too small, his face set in a permanent scowl. Silas was with him. "Nita," Brody said, tipping his hat but offering no warmth. "Mr. Silas here has officially reopened his brother's missing persons case. He seems to think there are new leads." He glanced around her property, his eyes lingering on the old well, the small, sturdy shed, as if a body could be hidden there for 30 years. "There's nothing to find," Nita said, her voice flat. "We'll be the judge of that," Brody said. "We're going to organize a new search. More thorough this time. We'll be bringing in men, dogs." Her heart seized. They were going to tear her land apart. Her sanctuary, her fortress, was about to be invaded, all because of a ghost. Silas wouldn't meet her eyes. He just stared out at the harsh landscape, his jaw tight. Was this guilt? Or was he just frustrated his hunt was proving fruitless? The search began the next day. A dozen men from the town, led by Brody, fanned out across her property and the surrounding mesas. They were loud, careless, trampling the fragile desert plants, their voices echoing in the canyons that had known only her silence for so long. Nita stayed inside, a prisoner in her own home, listening to the shouts, the whistles, the barking of the dogs. It was a violation. That evening, Silas returned, covered in dust, his face grim. He found her by the fire pit, staring into the embers. "Nothing," he said, his voice raw with exhaustion. "We found nothing." "I told you," she said, not looking at him. He sat down on a log across from her. For a long time, they just sat in silence, listening to the fire crackle. The search party had gone, but the land felt bruised, disturbed. "Tell me about him," Silas said finally, his voice softer now. "Tell me about my brother, the man you knew, not the one in the letters." Nita hesitated. She hadn't spoken about the real Caleb to anyone, ever. She had buried him. But now, looking at Silas's tired, searching face, a sliver of something thawed inside her. He wasn't just an accuser. He was a grieving brother, lost in a 30-year-old mystery. So she talked. She told him about Caleb's charm, the smile that could coax a confession from a stone. But she also told him about the darkness behind it, the jealousy, the way he'd belittle her skills, her heritage, calling her traditions superstitions, the way he'd get a fever in his eyes when he talked about money, about making a big score and leaving this dusty life behind. He was obsessed with the stories, she said, her voice barely a whisper. The old Apache stories about the lost silver. He thought my family knew where it was. He thought I was holding out on him. Silas listened, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. He didn't love me, Nita said, the admission tasting like rust. He loved an idea. He loved what he thought I could give him. When she finished, the silence returned, but it was different. It was heavier, filled with the weight of her truth. "Why didn't you tell Sheriff Peters this?" Silas asked. "He wouldn't have believed me," Nita said with a bitter laugh. "The word of the strange Apache woman against the charming visitor from back east? No. They already had their story. The scorned woman. The lover's quarrel." Silas stared into the fire, turning her words over in his mind. She could almost see the gears turning, the story he'd held onto for 30 years starting to crack. "There's one person," Nita said suddenly, the thought coming to her out of nowhere. "One person who might know something. Elena, the old healer. She sees things, hears things the rest of us don't." Silas looked up, his eyes sharp with interest. "Where is she?" "She lives up in the canyons," Nita said. "A 2-hour ride. I can take you there, at sunrise." It was a risk, trusting him, helping him, but something had shifted between them. Her story had planted a seed of doubt in him, and for the first time in 30 years, Nita felt a flicker of something that wasn't despair. It was a dangerous, fragile thing. It was the hope of being believed. The ride to Elena's was silent, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It was a shared quiet, the sound of two people moving with a single purpose. The rising sun painted the canyon walls in strokes of orange and purple. Elena's home was tucked into a rock overhang, almost invisible against the stone. It was a place of deep peace, the air thick with the smell of drying herbs and wood smoke. Elena was ancient, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her eyes as dark and knowing as the night sky. She greeted Nita with a warm, gnarled hand. Her gaze on Silas was sharp, analytical. She knew why they were there before they even spoke. "The past is a hungry ghost," she said, her voice like stones rubbing together. "It is never truly buried." They sat with her on woven blankets, and Nita explained everything. Silas's arrival, the reopened case, her story about Caleb and his obsession with the lost silver. Elena listened, her eyes closed, as if she were hearing the story not with her ears, but with her soul. When Nita finished, the old woman was silent for a long time. Then, she opened her eyes and looked directly at Silas. "Your brother was not looking for silver," she said. Silas and Nita exchanged a confused look. "The stories of the silver are a trick," Elena continued. "A lie told to outsiders to keep them away from the real treasure. He was looking for the water." "Water?" Silas asked, bewildered. "There's nothing but dry creeks out here." "Not on the surface," Elena said, a faint smile touching her lips. "There is a spring, an underground river that flows through these rocks. Our people called it the heart of the mountain. It is a sacred place, a place of life. To control the water in this land is to control everything. It is a treasure far greater than any metal." Nita's mind reeled. She remembered her grandfather's stories, hushed tales of a hidden spring, a place so secret that to speak its location was forbidden. She had thought they were just legends. "Caleb was a clever man," Elena said, her gaze turning to Nita. He didn't believe in our spirits, but he believed in our secrets. He spent months studying old maps, reading the journals of the first settlers. He was getting close. He found the trail. What trail? Nita pressed. Elena rose and walked to the entrance of her dwelling. She pointed to a tall, solitary rock formation on the opposite canyon wall. It was shaped like a man with his head bowed, as if in prayer. Follow the shadow of the weeping man at high noon, she said. It will point to the thirsty stone. That is the door. It was a riddle, a piece of the puzzle Nita never even knew existed. But be warned, Elena said, her voice turning grave. That place is guarded. Your brother was not the only one looking for it. He had partners, vicious men. He was trying to cut them out, to claim the prize for himself. Greed is a snake that always eats its own tail. Partners. The word hung in the air. This wasn't just about Caleb anymore. He had brought other devils into their desert. As they rode back down the canyon, the world looked different. The familiar landscape was now layered with secrets, with clues and dangers Nita had never imagined. Caleb hadn't just left her. He had been swallowed by a conspiracy of his own making. Silas was quiet, his face a mask of stone. The image of his charming, wronged brother was crumbling, being replaced by a portrait of a greedy, reckless man who had gotten in way over his head. When they got back to Nita's land, the search party was gone for the day. The place was quiet again, but the disturbed earth was a reminder of the storm that was coming. Partners, Silas said, breaking the silence. He was staring at the distant shape of the weeping man. If Caleb had partners, and he crossed them, then they might be the ones who… He couldn't finish the sentence. Or they might still be looking, Nita said, a new cold fear creeping into her heart. 30 years had passed, but for a prize like the heart of the mountain, some men would wait a lifetime. They could be anywhere. They could be anyone. Suddenly, the friendly waves from neighbors in town, the kind smile of Tom the ranch hand, the watchful eyes of Sheriff Brody, it all looked different. The whole world was suspect. Tomorrow, Silas said, his voice firm, resolute. At noon, we follow the shadow. He was no longer just a brother seeking a lost sibling. He was a man hunting for the truth, no matter how ugly it was. And Nita, the woman who thought her life was over, was standing right beside him. She had spent 30 years hiding from the world. Now she was about to walk into its darkest secret. The sun beat down on them, the heat shimmering off the rocks. It was 5 minutes to noon. Nita and Silas stood at the base of the weeping man, the giant rock formation that had been a silent fixture of her entire life. Today, it felt like a ticking clock. Nita's heart hammered against her ribs. She was a woman who cherished routine, who found safety in the predictable turning of the seasons. Now she was chasing a 30-year-old ghost based on a riddle from a mystic. She glanced at Silas. His face was grim, his eyes fixed on the tip of the rock formation, watching as its shadow slowly, imperceptibly, crept across the canyon floor. "It's moving," he said, his voice low. They watched as the pointed shadow stretched out like a long, dark finger. It traveled over scrub brush and stones until it finally touched the base of a sheer cliff face about 100 yards away. The tip of the shadow rested on a single large boulder. The boulder was darker than the surrounding rock, its surface pocked with holes like a sponge, the thirsty stone. They ran, scrambling over the uneven ground. As they got closer, Nita could see that the boulder wasn't just resting against the cliff. It was set into it like a plug. There were no obvious seams, no handles. It looked like it had been there for 1,000 years. "It's a door," Silas breathed, running his hands over its rough surface. "It has to be." They pushed. They pulled. It was useless. The stone was immovable. Silas took a crowbar from his saddlebag and tried to find a purchase, but the rock was fitted too perfectly. Sweat poured down his face. Frustration mounted. "There has to be a trick to it," Nita said, thinking of Elena's words. She walked around the boulder, examining it from every angle. Her fingers traced the strange, porous holes on its surface. They were cool to the touch, despite the blistering sun. Thirsty stone. What does a thirsty stone need? Water, she whispered. The answer was so simple, so elemental, she almost laughed. She unslung her canteen and poured the water into the largest of the holes at the top of the boulder. For a second, nothing happened. The water just vanished into the rock. Then they heard it. A low, deep grinding sound. A sound from within the mountain. Slowly, with the groan of ancient mechanisms, the thirsty stone began to recede into the cliff face, revealing a dark, yawning opening. A cave. The air that wafted out was cool and damp, smelling of wet earth and deep time. It was the entrance to the secret Caleb had died for. Silas lit a lantern, its yellow glow pushing back against the oppressive darkness. He looked at Nita, a silent question in his eyes. Was she ready for this? She nodded, her fear overshadowed by a relentless need to know. They stepped inside. The passage was narrow at first, then it opened into a vast cavern. The lantern light danced off walls that glittered with mineral deposits, and in the center of the cavern, they heard it, the sound of running water. They followed the sound to its source. It was a pool of water so clear it looked like liquid crystal, bubbling up from a fissure in the rock floor, the heart of the mountain. Elena was right. It was a miracle, a river of life flowing beneath the dead, dry desert. But their wonder was cut short by what they saw next to the pool, a rotted leather satchel. Silas knelt, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a book, a journal. The leather was molded, the pages warped by moisture, but the ink was still legible. It was Caleb's, his final entries. They sat by the light of the lantern, the sound of the hidden spring a quiet witness, and they read. The words on the page didn't just crack the mystery. They blew it wide open, revealing a betrayal more twisted than either of them could have imagined. Caleb had found the spring. But Elena was right. He wasn't alone. He named his partners, a man named Marcus Thorne, a ruthless land speculator, and his hired muscle, a man known only as Jed. They had financed his search using old maps Thorne had acquired, but Caleb, in his greed, had decided to double-cross them. The journal laid out his entire plan. He was going to lure Thorne and Jed to the cave, but to a different, unstable section. He'd planned a rockfall, a way to seal them in forever. Then he would file a claim on the land, using Nita as a pawn. That's where the story turned truly monstrous. His plan was to vanish, to make it look like he'd been murdered, and he was going to frame Nita for it. She's the perfect scapegoat, he wrote, the quiet Apache woman the town already thinks is strange. Her family has lived on this worthless dirt for generations. I'll make it look like she killed me to protect her precious ancestral land. I've been laying the groundwork for months, telling her she's a burden, making our fights public. When I disappear, everyone will look at her. By the time they realize I'm not dead, I'll be in California, the water rights sold, a rich man. She can rot in jail for all I care. Nita felt the air leave her lungs. The words he had used to destroy her self-worth, the scars she had carried for 30 years, they weren't born of malice. They were born of calculation. She wasn't a burden. She was a tool, a piece in his sick game. Silas read the words, his face pale, his expression turning from grief to pure, cold fury. The brother he had mourned was a monster. But the final entry was the most chilling. It was hurried, panicked. They're early. Thorne is here, but Jed isn't with him. He brought someone else, someone young. I don't like his eyes. Something's wrong. They know. I think they know I was going to cross them. That was it. The journal ended there. Caleb hadn't sprung his trap. A different trap had been sprung on him. A floorboard creaked above them. Wait. There were no floorboards in a cave. Nita and Silas froze, their eyes darting up. The sound had come from the entrance. A pebble skittered down the narrow passage. Someone else was here. Someone had followed them. Silas extinguished the lantern, plunging them into absolute blackness. The only sound was the gurgle of the spring and the frantic beating of their own hearts. They heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing in the passage. 2 sets of them. A powerful flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the cavern walls. "I know you're in here," a voice called out. It was a voice Nita knew, a voice she heard every week at the market, a voice she had always thought was kind. It was Tom, the young ranch hand. The beam of the flashlight found them, pinning them against the far wall of the cave. Nita squinted, her hand flying to her face. Tom stood at the entrance to the main cavern, a pistol held steady in his hand. But he wasn't alone. Behind him stood another man, older, with a face like a hawk and cold, dead eyes. Sheriff Brody. Nita's blood ran cold. The law itself was part of this. "Drop the journal, Silas," Brody said, his voice calm, authoritative, the voice of a man in complete control. "It's over." "Brody, what is this?" Silas asked, his voice tight with disbelief, his hand hovering over his own holstered pistol. "This," Brody said with a smirk, "is a 30-year-old piece of unfinished business." The young man, Tom, stepped forward into the light. But as he got closer, Nita saw the details she'd never noticed before. The slight scar above his eyebrow, the chilling emptiness in his smile. He looked nothing like the shy, kind boy she thought he was. "You've got my father's journal," he said, his voice losing its folksy drawl, becoming cold and sharp. "I'd like it back." "Your father?" Silas breathed, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying speed. "Caleb wasn't my father," the young man said with a sneer. "My father was Marcus Thorne, the man your brother and his partner Jed murdered right here in this cave. My father came here to make a deal, and they buried him in the rocks." It was another shocking twist. Caleb and Jed hadn't been double-crossed. They were the ones who had set the trap, and it had worked. They had killed Marcus Thorne. Jed got spooked and ran, Tom, or whoever he was, continued. But Caleb stayed. He was going to take it all for himself, the water, the land. He just had to get rid of the Apache girl first. "So, what happened to him?" Nita asked, her voice trembling. Sheriff Brody laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed in the cavern. "What do you think happened?" "I happened. My father was Sheriff Peters. He was on Marcus Thorne's payroll from the beginning. When Thorne didn't check in, my father came looking. He found Caleb here, trying to hide the body." The whole story, the whole 30 years, was a lie. Sheriff Peters wasn't a suspicious cop. He was a dirty one, covering his tracks. "My father dealt with Caleb," Brody said, his eyes glinting. And then he came up with a much better story. The scorned lover, the mysterious disappearance. It kept anyone from looking too close, from finding this place. "And it kept you," he said, pointing a finger at Nita. "Scared, alone, and right where we could watch you. A perfect watchdog who didn't even know she was guarding a treasure." Nita felt sick. Her entire life, her isolation, her pain, it had all been manufactured. She was a pawn in a game that had been running for 3 decades. "And you?" Silas said, looking at the young man. "Who are you?" "I'm the heir," he said, his chest puffing out. "I'm Thorne's son. After my father disappeared, Brody's father contacted me. We've had an arrangement ever since. I've been playing the part of a simple ranch hand, waiting, watching her, waiting for someone like you to come along and shake things up, to lead us right here. It was a trap laid 30 years ago, and they had just walked right into it. Now," Brody said, raising his gun, "the journal, then the girl, and then you, Silas. We'll seal the cave. By the time anyone finds you, if they ever do, all they'll find are 3 people who got lost and starved. A tragic accident." The flashlight beam was blinding. The gun was steady. The sound of the sacred spring seemed to mock them. They had found the truth, only to be buried with it. There was no way out. Brody's finger tightened on the trigger. "No," Nita said. The word was quiet, but it cut through the tension in the cave. Everyone looked at her. The scared, lonely woman. The pawn. The watchdog. But the woman they were looking at wasn't that person anymore. The woman they were looking at had just had 30 years of lies stripped away. What was left was not weakness. It was pure, distilled rage. "This is my land," she said, her voice growing stronger, echoing with the power of generations. "My water. You will not take it." Brody laughed. "You and what army, old woman?" "This one," she said, and then she screamed. But it wasn't a scream of fear. It was a high, piercing shriek, a sound that seemed to shake the very stones around them. It was a signal. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Brody just sneered. Then, from the dark, narrow passages leading off the main cavern, came a sound, a low growl that vibrated through the floor. Then another, and another. Shadows detached themselves from the deeper darkness. Eyes glinted in the edges of the flashlight beam. A pack of mountain lions, sleek and powerful, emerged from the tunnels. They were the true guardians of this place, the spirits Elena had spoken of. Nita had known about them since she was a girl. She had left them offerings, spoken to them, respected their home. They knew her scent. They knew her voice. They did not know Brody or Thorne's son. The two men froze, their cocky smiles vanishing, replaced by masks of primal terror. The flashlight beam shook wildly, dancing between the approaching predators. That was the opening Silas needed. He moved like lightning, drawing his pistol and firing not at the men, but at the rock ceiling above them. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. A shower of rock and dust rained down. Thorne's son screamed and fired his pistol wildly into the darkness. In the chaos, Nita acted. She grabbed the lantern, which Silas had relit, and hurled it at a fissure in the cavern wall, a spot where thick, dark oil seeped from the rock, something her grandfather had called the mountain's blood. The lantern shattered, the oil ignited. A wall of fire roared up between them and their attackers, casting the entire cavern in a terrifying, flickering hellscape. The lions, spooked by the fire and the gunshots, retreated back into their tunnels. "The water!" Nita screamed to Silas, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward the back of the cave. "There's another way out! Through the spring!" She didn't hesitate. She took a deep breath and plunged into the crystal-clear, ice-cold pool. For a moment, the shock of the cold stole her breath. Then Silas was right behind her. They swam down, into the fissure from which the water flowed. It was a tunnel, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The current was strong, pulling them deeper into the heart of the mountain. The darkness was absolute, the pressure immense. Panic clawed at Nita, but she fought it back, trusting the old stories, trusting the water. After what felt like an eternity, she saw a faint, shimmering light above them. With her lungs burning, she kicked toward it, breaking the surface and gasping for air. They had emerged in a small, hidden grotto, open to the night sky, a few hundred yards down the canyon from the cave entrance. They were alive. They were free. They lay on the bank, gasping, shivering, listening. They could hear the faint, panicked shouts of Brody and Thorne's son, trapped behind a wall of fire in a cave full of smoke. Their greed had become their tomb. As the first rays of dawn touched the canyon rim, Nita and Silas stood, looking back at the mountain. The truth was finally out. The ghosts had been faced. The land was safe. Silas turned to her, his face streaked with soot, his eyes full of an emotion she couldn't quite name. It was more than gratitude. It was awe. You were never weak," he said, his voice ragged. "You were the strongest person I've ever met. I was too blind to see it." The cruel words that had defined her life, burden, hollow, too weak to be loved, they were nothing now. Just smoke and echoes. Caleb hadn't seen her. The town hadn't seen her. Even Silas, at first, had only seen the ghost of his brother's lies. But the mountain had seen her. And now, she finally saw herself. She was not an ember. She was the fire. They walked back to her small house as the desert bloomed with the colors of a new day. The search party was gone. The patrol car was gone. The world was quiet. But it was a new kind of quiet. A quiet filled with peace, not loneliness. They stood by the fire pit, where this long night had begun. The ashes were cold. "I'm sorry, Nita," Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. "For my brother, for my suspicion, for the 30 years you spent carrying his poison." "You didn't give me the poison," she said, looking him in the eyes. "You brought the antidote, the truth." He reached out and took her hand. His palm was rough, calloused, but his grip was steady, grounding, a connection. "I told you I grew old waiting for you," he said softly. I think I was waiting for you to save me from my family's ghosts. I think I was waiting to see what real strength looked like." Dawn crept over the horizon, setting the sky ablaze. The harsh desert, which had been her prison, now shimmered with promise. The years behind them no longer felt wasted. They felt like a long, hard road that had finally led them home. As the sun broke free, she saw him not as a savior, but as a mirror, reflecting back the strength she had always carried, the endurance that was never, ever weakness. He leaned closer, his voice a whisper that wrapped around her like the morning warmth. "You were never too weak to be loved, Nita. The world was just too weak to deserve you, until now." In the heart of the woman who was once resigned to solitude, a great flame rose, untamed and eternal. Her story wasn't over. It was just beginning. If you were moved by Nita's story of strength and survival, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of the unexpected. And let us know in the comments. What do you think is the difference between endurance and true strength?